Thanks so much for coming out on this, what day is it, Monday? Monday afternoon for the START open house of the zoning modernization project for Albemarle County. We're going to have a lot of future engagement opportunities, but we wanted to take this particular time to get everybody aware of the process, of the phasing of the process, and kind of answer any questions that we have about what's going to happen and what this is going to look like. So I am going to hand it over to Rebecca Cobb with the Berkeley Group. After the presentation that she gives, staff will be again out in the lobby. We all have these handy little name tags, and then there are a couple of Berkeley Group staff that will also point out, and we can answer any questions you have at that point. I don't know if we want to give a brief explanation of what's going on with the boards, but then we'll be there to help you out and get started.
Yep.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you, Leah. So as you mentioned, I am Rebecca Cobb with the Berkeley Group, and we are helping Albemarle County with this zoning ordinance modernization project. And it's good to see so many in this room. When you're talking about zoning, you don't know if only 2 people will show up and one of those might fall asleep or what. So good to see so many people interested in this project. For my presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit on some background information about what is zoning, what is in a zoning ordinance for anyone who maybe is just tuning in and is interested. We'll also talk about how this relates to the AC 44 project. And we'll talk about this project schedule, the phasing that we'll be doing. We're going to talk about some diagnostic findings. We've already been pulling to the zoning ordinance, comparing it to the Virginia Code. And then we'll also talk about results from our focus groups, and also talk about the proposed table of contents, and then get into what's next. And then, of course, we will have open house time as well, where we can mill about outside, look at those boards, and provide some information to us. So what is a zoning ordinance? A zoning ordinance defines how land in the county can be used and developed. The Virginia State Code allows localities to adopt a zoning ordinance. And it says when you adopt an ordinance, there are some specific elements that have to be followed very strictly, and there are some things that can be more defined and decided by the county. Some of those things typically regulated in the ordinance includes lot sizes, heights of buildings, parking requirements, landscaping requirements, those types of things, and we'll talk more about that. In terms of the relationship with the comprehensive plan is the policy document for the community. So it sets the vision and goals for the future and helps guide the regulation. And so your zoning ordinance is the regulatory document that's going to help bring that vision to fruition. It regulates land and structures in terms of size, height, area, where it's located, and ensures light and air. And then also protects from destruction and obstruction, encroachment and congestion, dangers, and addresses adverse impacts. A little more in terms of the relationship between these two documents. The comprehensive plan contains your future land use map. It contains recommendations regarding the physical, social, and economic development. And it's very broad, dealing with concepts and policies. And it's looking to the future. Whereas the zoning ordinance has an official zoning map, and it primarily regulates physical development. And it's very specific, talking about particular parcels or particular areas and addressing projects within those, dealing with development that's happening now. And so it's a regulatory document. And so along with that zoning ordinance, I mentioned the zoning map. Those two things go hand in hand. The zoning ordinance has zoning districts. You can see all of the Albemarle County zoning districts on the screen. Far left are residential districts. In the middle there are your commercial and industrial. And then to the right are planned development districts. And all of these are on the zoning map. And so if you're interested in, well, what is my particular parcel zoned, or what is this particular area zoned, you can visit the county website and look that up. You can talk to county staff and they can help you as well determine what zoning district is that particular parcel. And so then when you're looking at the zoning ordinance and you know the district of the parcel, then you can apply, okay, what are the regulations associated with that parcel? There are district standards that outline things like size of lots, setbacks. There are going to be use standards telling you which uses are allowed in those districts. And then if there's by right uses, sometimes there are use performance standards that address those impacts for those areas. You'll also see which uses are not allowed within the district. There's also community design standards. These are things like signs, landscaping, lighting. All of those standards are within the zoning ordinance. So another look at these, the district standards, as I mentioned, regulating buildings, where they sit, how tall they are, those types of things, the setbacks, your lot coverage in terms of how many structures are on a lot, and so making sure you're meeting that lot coverage requirement. That's also something that can be in district standards. And then uses are typically grouped into categories: residential, commercial, industrial, and so on. And so you'll see in residential districts, there are more residential uses that are allowed. And in commercial districts, there's more commercial districts that are allowed. But where the comprehensive plan can kind of come into play here is looking at particular areas and even districts and saying, well, we want this to be more of a mix. This should serve, you know, any need within the neighborhood. And so in those districts, you might see some residential uses allowed, some commercial uses allowed, some civic, accessory uses. All of those things could be allowed in a particular district. In terms of use standards associated with this, we would want to address any impacts. So a use might be by right, but the hours of operation might need to be thought about. You know, we don't want to impact neighbors in terms of, you know, late hours and making noise and those types of things. So that's an example of some use standards that could be applied. The community design standards include signs, lighting, parking, landscaping, and these are all things that govern how your community looks and feels. And so there might be, you know, standards for, you know, if you're residential and you're against a commercial. So there would be landscaping standards that talk about, well, you've got to plant this number of trees or this number of shrubs. It has to be this wide of a buffer between those uses. So those are some examples there. One more thing about zoning is there are things that zoning can do and things that zoning cannot do. So it can divide land into districts. We've been talking about that and talking about the different uses that can be allowed in those districts. It regulates the size and type of buildings, requires development standards to minimize impacts. We've talked about that. Protects sensitive resources from inconsistent and harmful use, enhancing community character. So that's those landscaping, sign things that we just mentioned, supporting affordable housing and economic goals. But things that it cannot do are change or correct land use buildings that are already in existence. If there's something in your community that you're like, this is an eyesore, it's hideous, it has so many impacts, that's not something that we can write into zoning to correct right now. We can think about the future so that it doesn't happen again, but it's not going to correct an existing issue. We can't guarantee that development will occur, so just because something is zoned commercial and you allow a particular use in that commercial district does not mean that that particular thing that you're interested in is going to develop there. You can't ensure land uses will be permanent. If it develops there, it may not stay there. And you have to treat similar uses the same. You can't treat them differently within districts. So this would be in terms of housing. So if housing, particular type of housing, you can't say, well, if you have this particular design, then you can have this much density. And if your design is like this, then you can't have that density. So those things need to be treated equally. You can't ensure property is maintained. These are done through other ordinances. So if things are unsightly, grass is too tall, there's trash, or those types of things would be addressed through other county ordinances. Guide public or private investment in infrastructure. So there might be an area that really needs public water and sewer. But those things that the zoning ordinance cannot mandate that those things be located there. So that's it about the zoning ordinance, and most of you may have already known those things, but now moving into the modernization project itself. So, as you may know, the current ordinance was adopted in 1980, and since that time there have been amendments and there have been updates to the ordinance. But when that happens, sometimes things get shifted around. It's hard to make those amendments, and so some things may be here, some things there. And so one thing that this is going to do is help organize that a bit better. We will be overhauling the entire ordinance. So looking at the whole thing, seeing where it can be restructured, looking at the regulations and seeing where there needs to be improvements. The project is going to occur over 5 separate phases, and I'll go through those phases in a little bit, as well as there is a board out at the open house portion that you can look at as well. We are expecting completion in the 3 to 4 year time frame. However, this will be contingent upon AC 44, the comprehensive plan update, because this is going to be aligned and informed by that project. So as I mentioned early on, this is the regulatory document that's working towards the vision of that comprehensive plan, and so we need to make sure that comprehensive plan process moves along so that it can inform what gets put in this ordinance. So those documents are working hand in hand. The intent for this project is to make sure the ordinance is compliant with the Code of Virginia. We want to clarify language where there's been questions, whether from the public or from staff. We want to clarify those things and make it very clear for anyone who picks up the ordinance to be able to read and understand. We're going to address modern zoning issues. So staff has a list of things that have been coming up, as well as zoning has been changing, and so there are new uses and new things to consider. We will do that during this update. We're going to consider zoning flexibility. We're going to revise for compatibility with the comprehensive plan, which I've already mentioned, and we're going to organize the structure of the ordinance. And so again, making it easy to find things and look at find what you're looking for. So the project phases, we're currently in phase 1. Phase 1, we've included some focus groups. We've talked to them and asked them questions about administration of the ordinance, permit requirements, and those types of things. We've been reviewing the ordinance and wrote a report, which I'll also go through some of those highlights for you. And we're establishing the table of contents. The articles that we are drafting in this first phase include the general, the administration, permits and applications, and nonconformities. A lot of this is going to be heavily determined by Code of Virginia. Code of Virginia sets standards about how long you have to process a permit. In the administration, we talk about Planning Commission duties, BZA or Board of Zoning Appeals duties and responsibilities. Those things are dictated through the state code, and they will all be addressed in these articles. Phase 2, we will have some investigation, some public engagement time, and then we will start drafting the design standards, looking at lighting, landscaping, signs, parking, and entrance corridors. In Phase 3, again, we'll have some investigation time to look at the ordinance, talk to groups, talk to the public, and then we will draft district standards. So this is going to include setbacks, building heights, step backs, lot size, density, and also looking at potential map updates. And then Phase 4, same thing, an investigation portion, and then a drafting portion, which is going to include the use permission and use matrix, performance standards, looking at housing types, rural area uses. And so I'll say here, Phases 3 and 4, the timeline for these are going to be contingent upon the AC 44, because these topics will really need to relate to what's been decided for the community through that process. And so when you see housing types here, that's something that we'll look to. When the community says, you know, these are the housing types we want in this area, these are the rural area uses, we'll be looking at the comprehensive plan for some of that information. Phase 5 is going to be a final compilation where we take all of the drafted material, we will look through it again, review, fine-tune, get additional public input, and then move it into adoption. A closer look at this Phase 1 that we're in right now, and the big star is sort of you are here at the open house. As you can see, we did do that investigation starting in August of last year. We had some interviews with focus groups, which included staff, planning commission, and cadre. And now we're moving into the drafting portion of those articles that I mentioned.
That's 2023, right?
Yes, 2023. Sorry. Yeah, we're not in January 2022. I will note also a change to this is this says that the next work session would be February. As of last week, that's actually shifted to March. So stay tuned. I will say on the agenda you received, there is a QR code you can get to and the website where you can go to this project to keep updated on when we're having meetings and information that we're putting out. But this phase will finish in summer of this year. Again, this investigation portion, we talked with Planning Commission, staff, and a focus group. We're also collecting some information from you all, so please be sure to fill out some sticky notes and do some dot exercise that's out there at the open house portion. We had a county tour where we got to go around and see your community, and staff highlighted some areas of concern and areas of growth and those types of things for us to consider. And then in terms of content development, we've conducted the diagnostic. We have created the table of contents, and now we're in this administrative provisions, beginning drafting of that. And then, as mentioned, we'll move into adoption later on in the project. So in terms of the report, we do have a couple of reports printed out if you wanted to take a look and you haven't already. It's also on the website, and I think I saw some people coming in with them already, so you've been looking at this. And in this our main focus here was to look at the state code, particularly Title 15.2, Chapter 22, relating to zoning ordinances, and seeing where Albemarle lines up in terms of compliance with those code sections. We also thought about, what we were hearing from staff, what we were hearing from Planning Commission, and the group cadre as well. So you'll see some of that in the report. In terms of overall looking at how Albemarle did with the state code, you fared very well. Not all of the code is applicable. About 85% of what's in there applies to Albemarle. And most of those things you are in compliance with. Those things that are required of Albemarle, there are some things that were partially compliant, some things that are not in compliance, but those are the things that we wanted to identify, so when we do this modernization, we can make sure we're incorporating and correcting those items. There's also items in the code that are optional provisions that might not fit for Albemarle. You're using a little over half of those now, and so the remaining items might be things that you want to incorporate, or they might be things that don't fit with Albemarle, and that's okay. But so generally you are in compliance with the state code. I'll just kind of highlight a few things from that evaluation report. Page 9, we talk about the permitting process, that this could be simplified, making sure there's definitions, clear definitions to support what's being requested and what different permits are, having clear application requirements, streamlining with more administrative approval, so making that process a little bit easier where it can be. Site plans, we talk about on page 10, again, having clear submission requirements, limiting resubmission, and having specific denial process. This is going to ease administrative burdens. If everyone knows and is clear on this is what I need to submit, there won't be a lot of resubmissions, and the process will move a lot smoother. Reducing length and complexity of the process itself is also an improvement that can be made. And then in terms of districts and district standards on page 10, reducing waiver requests. There are a lot of waivers that occur for the same and similar type things, and so we can change the ordinance text so that is already allowed, and you don't have to request those waivers. Allow more low-impact uses in the RA district, and then reevaluating the neighborhood model district. In terms of uses, we want to put a use matrix within the ordinance. Staff already uses one, I believe internally. It may also be on your web for citizen use, but if you've got it in your ordinance, it's there for everyone to easily access. The bottom of the screen here demonstrates an example from another community. We would do something similar in Albemarle to specify the use, what district it's allowed in, if there's any special permitting requirements, and also if there's any use performance standards. So we would add use standards. In the report, we talk about amending those frequent modification requests. So if there's standards that people are always asking for amendments to, modification to, then those things we can edit so that you don't have to come and request that. And then integrating past zoning determinations. There's lots of things where there's been things that are unclear within the ordinance, and making that clear for everyone. And then kind of looking at the community design portion, streets and landscaping, we heard that needs to be aligned with VDOT. And then also considering native species and mature sizes in the areas that those are being required in. Parking is on page 14, and we talk about including maximum parking limits. This is something that is changing in many communities. Instead of requiring minimums, they're moving to parking maximums. Clarifying the surfacing requirements, and then also critical slopes need some clarity there, as well as allowing minor disturbances. Signs as well, reducing the burden for the Board of Zoning Appeals. So that's some basic highlights from the report. If you want to see more, you can use the code at the bottom of your agenda. You could go to the website and see the full report. In terms of the phase 1 focus groups, I mentioned that we talked to staff, we talked to the Planning Commission, and then we talked to a group that we thought, submits a lot of permits. They've been through the process a lot, and that was Cadre, the Charlottesville Area Development Roundtable, met with us and talked about their experiences with the permitting process. And so some key highlights from those three groups, these were kind of common themes that we heard. There's also a board outside for you all to look at some more of these and provide us your feedback in terms of if you agree what these groups say or if you disagree with those groups. But generally, some of the themes that we heard was that the ordinance is complex, right? The application submissions are inconsistent, and some of that is probably related to how complex the ordinance is. There's a lengthy approval process. We heard that there should be more by right uses, that increasing density and building height in certain districts and certain areas are important. And then reevaluating the neighborhood model district was also something that was a common theme between these districts or between these groups. So a little bit deeper dive at the specific groups and what they had to say. The staff said that providing a complete list of application requirements was important, and explaining the permit processes, creating a more efficient site plan process. And so these three things are things that we will be addressing in this phase 1. And you'll see the things at the bottom of the screen, kind of the aqua teal color, are things that we can address in later phases. So looking at reducing administrative burdens of that neighborhood model district, addressing minor disturbances within critical slopes, changing uses to by right with some use standards, and clarifying and refining existing use standards. The Planning Commission, we also have 3 things here that we'll be looking at in this phase 1, requiring additional detail in applications, streamlining application processes, consider adding a work session prior to public hearings. This one would be something that would have a trigger. This wouldn't be necessarily with all applications, but if something is large or complex, then you could have a work session with the Planning Commission to answer their questions. You get feedback before you move into the public hearing phase. And then in subsequent phases for this project, we would be looking at modernizing industrial uses, considering incentives for low impact development, adding maximum parking limits, addressing or removing height and step back standards. And from Cadre, we heard clarifying permitting processes, reduce the details required on concept plans, create a desktop process for site plan discrepancies. So if site plans, if you're hearing things from one reviewer and something else from somebody else on another part of it, then you can all sit down together to help work that out. Allowing building permit processes to start prior to final site plan approval. And so you may notice here that some of these things are a little bit different. Some of them match really well, and some of them are sort of on opposite ends of the spectrum. And so during this phase 1 and through all of the phases, as we take this input, we're going to be looking at the input from our focus groups and our community. We're also going to be looking at best practices. We're going to be looking at similar communities as well. And then from there, giving what we think fits Albemarle and is the best solution. And we will present that to the Planning Commission, who will then make final determinations before we move forward. In other phases here, Cadre said incorporate maximum setbacks instead of minimum, update recreational amenity requirements, and allow more by right housing options. There is additional information on what these focus groups said. It's in the back of that report. I think it is Appendix C. So in terms of the table of contents, the table of contents are Article 1 we are working on currently. It's going to be your general provisions. It's going to contain the authority to have an ordinance, the interpretation, zoning map, and then transition after adoption. So if there's any permits or things that are outstanding when it's adopted, what happens to those? Does it have to meet with what it was submitted under or comply with the current ordinance? So we address that in this Article 1. Article 2 is administration, so it's all about the duties and responsibilities of those that deal with it on a daily basis. So your zoning administrator, your planning commission, the BZA, the ARB. It talks about enforcement and fees and taxes and expenses being paid. Article 3 is the permits and applications, so getting into requirements for that site plan process, for zoning map amendments, those types of things, as well as appeals, and then the requirements on hearings and notifications. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of that will be dictated by the Code of Virginia, and we will supply those references to help with the reading of that portion. Article 4 is going to be the primary zoning district, so establishing those, having some general standards, making the comp plan connection, and then standards by the district type. So that's where your lot sizes, your setbacks, those things are going to be in Article 4. Article 5 is the overlay zoning district. We're going to establish those and have the standards related to those overlay districts. Article 6 is the use matrix, so that, remember that bottom of the screen, that matrix, that's where we plan on putting this and addressing the uses that are allowed in each district. Article 7 relates to the uses as well. It's the use performance standards. We're going to have those in the categories agricultural uses, residential, public civic, business, industrial, and then miscellaneous. Article 8 is the community design. So again, looking at the feel of the community through lighting, landscaping, walls and fences, street sidewalks, parking, loading, open space. All of those things will be addressed in Article 8. Article 9 is going to have your form-based design. So currently there is some RIO form-based code, which is very different from the other community design elements. And so we are separating this out into a separate article. And that also allows for future amendment. If there's desire for additional form-based items, they can easily be added into this article. Article 10 addresses nonconformities, uses, lots, and structures. This is another one that we are actually doing in this first phase. It's heavily related to the state code requirements. And then Article 11 is the definitions. We will be addressing and looking at definitions throughout all of the phases. There's also, if you had a chance to look at that report, that appendix related to this table of contents, there's this crosswalk in there. And this contains all of the sections and sort of the title of the current ordinance. And then we have supplied where that's being moved to. So if there's a particular thing in the ordinance that you are concerned about, or you're like, I wish they would edit this, you can see there, okay, they're going to be editing this in when they talk about, Article 5 or Article 6. And then you can see through our phases when that will come up. So you can stay tuned and make sure you're participating during that phase. So that's it. In terms of next steps, we will be having a work session in March with the Planning Commission to talk about a couple of the articles. And then we will meet with them again to talk about a couple more articles. And then in July, we'll have all of those drafted and discuss that. We'll come back to the public as well for input. And that's it in terms of the presentation. I do ask all of you to please see the boards out at the open house. Myself, other Berkeley staff, and Albemarle staff will be there to answer any questions you have. Some of it is informative things from the report. There is a phasing out there as well. And we do want your feedback as well. We've got questions regarding the permit process. If you've been through the permitting process, please leave us a sticky note on there about what your experience was like or where you see improvements there. There's also another board about community design, so thinking about landscaping and parking and those types of standards. If you've got experiences with those, or you've got even questions or concerns about those, please use sticky notes to post those for us as well as reacting to the highlights from our focus groups. So that wraps it up for me, and I'll see you guys all out front. Thanks again for coming out.
Will this be published anywhere online, this presentation?
Yeah, so it has been recorded, as well as the presentation has been provided to the county, and I would say go to that Engage